This is a story about sun and wind. One winter day, sun and wind were talking. "I am stronger than you," said wind. "I can blow trees from the ground." "I am stronger," said sun. "I light the day and can dry up all that snow." Sun saw a young Blackfoot warrior wearing a heavy bear coat. "We will have a contest. If you can make the warrior take off his coat, you are stronger. If I can, then I am stronger. You go first." Wind agreed and blew a swift breeze, but the warrior didn't notice. Wind blew stronger gusts, but the warrior kept walking. Now wind blew a real storm. The trees shook and leaves scattered. Wind blew as hard as he could, but the warrior only pulled his coat tighter. At last, wind gave up. Sun smiled and began to show rays of bright, warm light. But the warrior kept walking. "Ha, ha," said wind. "Neither of us win." Sun was not quite finished, and then began to steadily beat down hot, bright rays of light. The warrior started to sweat, opened his bearskin coat, and after a while took his coat all the way off, and peacefully kept walking down the trail. The moral of the story: persuade gently. It works better than force. Native American justice and the educational system. But I'm not here today to make us white people feel bad about ourselves because of our history with Native Americans, but simply to raise awareness about what we can do as educators to help support Native American youth and their future in society. Support for Native youth is coming from many sources, such as the federal, state, and local and tribal governments, as well as private and nonprofit groups. All are making sure Native youth have opportunities they need to be successful in their futures. However, Native Americans have the highest poverty rates, the highest dropout rates, and drug and alcohol abuse in the nation. More than 1 out of 3 Native American children live in poverty. The national graduation rate for Native American students is 67%, which is the lowest of any racial or ethnic group in the United States, according to the 2014 Native Youth Report. In 2013, the graduation rate for Native Americans in Montana was 65%, compared to 87% of white students graduating. According to the Montana OPI, 9.9% of Native American students have been suspended at least once, compared to 2.9% of. Some of you may have heard of Richard Pratt, or Captain Richard Pratt, who fought in the Civil War, and if you haven't heard of him, you've definitely heard of his phrase, "kill the Indian and save the man." Government-sponsored schools, he came up with the Indian education, and sought to eliminate Native youth and their cultures and identities. Natives were stripped of their outward signs of tribal life and were required to wear uniforms, cut their hair, change their names to more Euro-American names. In the 1800s, I'm sure this Pratt guy and his educators probably thought they were doing these children a favor by eliminating their traditional ways of life and basically restructuring their ways of thinking to fit into Euro-American culture at the time. His Indian education plan would basically corrupt and tear families and tribal kinships. In 1969, the Indian Education and a National Tragedy, a National Challenge document came out, otherwise known as the Kennedy Reports. It reported to the nation what had been happening in these boarding schools that Richard Pratt had developed. These reports highlighted what was actually happening in the government-funded boarding schools, and the disastrous effects it was having on the Native American culture. However, in 1972, the Indian Education Act was signed. This helped to enhance the role of Native nations in education and helping families, tribal governments, and communities basically influence and direct their own children's future. This started a revamping of the Indian education system, which had basically significantly destroyed native traditions and languages for hundreds of years. There was over at least 150 different languages in California when the first Euro-Americans arrived, and that dropped significantly to, I think, about 50 languages now. But as of 2014, there are 37 tribal colleges and universities, and more than 200 Native American specific educational departments. Despite these significant signs of progress on the reservations, Native youth still continue to struggle for educational success. A lady by the name of Wilma Mankiller, she was the female principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. She once said that whomever controls the education of our students or our children controls our future. Today, one of the many root causes of Native youth discrepancies in their education is the challenge of recruiting and retaining, effective teachers. What I mean by an effective teacher is a teacher that cares about and builds upon meaningful relationships with their students. Children, where I worked for 2.5 years, I got the opportunity to work with Native American juveniles from across the country. These children had experienced forms of trauma that was hard to comprehend and so emotionally draining that building positive relationships was the most important goal of the school or the system out there. Without building trust, the students couldn't feel safe, and therefore they couldn't learn. And as a white teacher trying to form meaningful relationships with Native American students, it was difficult, especially when they're coming from a culture that dealt with several broken treaties and unrest, and basically told from their parents, their grandparents, just stories that have been passed down over time. It took me a lot of time and gentle patience, just like the warm sun, to build trust with them, and nothing was ever, forced on them, such as the wind. I will always remember a 3-day camping trip that I had organized with the Cathedral Home to help the Forest Service basically paint picnic tables. I was in charge of 20 delinquent teen boys and 4 counselors in the middle of the woods. I was a little stressed out. 3 of the boys were under close watch for being known runners. 2 others were part of the Shoshone tribe, and another tall boy was from the Apache tribe, and down in Wyoming, well, to make a long story short, these two tribes have a violent history and still aren't, getting along today. But starting back in like the early 1800s, when Lewis and Clark came through, eventually both tribes um, settled in Wyoming. Well, we're basically forced on the same reservation in Wyoming, which is now called the Wind River Reservation, just outside of Lander. So these boys were definitely and frequently always on my mind. However, everything I imagined going wrong didn't. There was no blood drawn and nobody ran away from camp. Mostly thanks to a little lie I told about there being a man-eating grizzly bear outside of camp. But it is amazing how taking children out of their normal everyday routine and into a natural environment changes them. One of the young Arapaho boys from Arizona and I became really good friends. Every evening we would go fly fishing together out on the lake. Many of the kids were interested in trying fly fishing, but none of them really stayed dedicated to it. However, him and I, every opportunity we got to go fishing out on the lake, we would go. We would keep on fishing until it just got absolutely too dark to see. During these evenings, we wouldn't have to say a word to each other for mostly fear of scaring the fish away, but with fly fishing, you really don't need any words to exchange and communicate. It's You can see the feelings and basically the cast that you're putting out there on the water, and then the excitement of catching a fish. I have a feeling that this time that I spent with this kid will hopefully help him to make better decisions in the future and impact him for the rest of his life. Much like the story earlier, teachers need to be that gentle ray of light and have patience, and to not be like a forceful wind rushing in order to get the bearskin coat off of him. People remember their good teachers, the ones that have influenced their life. They were great role models that students and adults now could look up to and aspire to be. Young Native students need strong teachers and role models that they can look up to and see hope for a better future. Being a meaningful teacher isn't about getting students to score well on tests, but to get students to believe in themselves and in their future. Teachers are lifelong learners. That's why I teach. And the greatest impact we can have on our students is passing this love of learning on.